The icy winds howled across the frozen planet, carrying snowflakes that stung like needles against the skin. Zara, the rebellious daughter of the mighty alien king of the Xorian Empire, stood at the edge of a high cliff, her body trembling from the bitter cold. Her once proud form, dressed in royal armor, now appeared fragile and defeated as she was left alone on this desolate wasteland. Just hours before, she had been a princess, respected by her people. But that respect was now shattered. Zara had defied her father's orders, challenging his harsh and oppressive rule. She had spoken out against the atrocities he had committed in the name of power, and for that, she had been betrayed. Her own father, the most feared ruler in the galaxy, had cast her aside, leaving her to die on this frozen planet. The punishment for her rebellion was exile, a death sentence in itself. She had always known the cold heart of her father, but never did she imagine that it would turn on her so violently. Zara's breath came out in puffs of freezing air as she moved carefully through the thick snow. Each step was an effort. Her legs felt heavy, weighed down not just by the freezing cold, but by the crushing loneliness that now gripped her. The empire that she had once been so proud to be a part of had turned its back on her. The thought of her father's betrayal twisted in her mind, sharp as the chill in the air. "You are nothing but a mistake," his words echoed in her mind. She had been his daughter, his blood, and yet she had been cast aside without a second thought. The landscape around her was vast, endless white stretching out to the horizon. There was no warmth here, no sign of life, only the biting cold in a world that seemed to echo her isolation. Zara was no stranger to hardship. As a Xorian princess, she had been trained for combat, strategy, and survival. But nothing could prepare her for this, a fight against the planet itself, a battle she had no chance of winning alone. Her once bright eyes, filled with the fire of rebellion, now held only exhaustion and desperation. Every breath she took felt like ice entering her lungs. She stumbled and fell to her knees, her hands sinking into the snow. She couldn't stop herself from shaking, her body slowly giving up against the freezing temperatures. She had been abandoned, left to die. Her strength was fading, and she was beginning to believe that her fate was sealed. But just as she was about to give in to the darkness closing in around her, something caught her attention. A distant sound, a rumble in the snowstorm that didn't belong to nature. Her heart skipped a beat, and she forced herself to stand, her muscles screaming in protest. The sound grew louder. It wasn't the wind, nor an animal. It was mechanical. Her mind raced. Could it be an enemy patrol sent by her father to ensure she didn't escape? Or maybe there was someone else, someone who could help her. But who would come to the aid of a traitor like her? Zara felt a bitter laugh bubbling up in her chest, but it was cut off by the sound of something large crashing into the planet's surface. Zara turned, her heart pounding in her chest. The snow had begun to settle where the object had landed. A ship. Not an enemy ship, but something smaller, something human. Zara's eyes widened. The thought that humans could be anywhere near this frozen wasteland seemed impossible. She had heard rumors of human colonies scattered across the galaxy, but they were so far out of reach. Yet here, now, in the midst of her despair, a human ship had crashed. Desperation and curiosity pushed her forward. Her feet barely obeyed her commands as she staggered toward the wreckage, her hope sparking like a dying flame. Zara knew she had little time. The cold was claiming her strength, and the snowstorm would soon make it impossible to navigate. But the ship was her only chance. It was her only hope. She reached the wreckage and saw the hull of the ship, now buried partially in the snow. The metal was scorched, charred from the crash. Zara's eyes scanned the area for any signs of life. She took a hesitant step closer, her breath shallow. And then she saw him, a human figure, barely moving, emerging from the wreckage. His uniform was strange to her, unlike anything she had ever seen, but it was unmistakably human. The man, a soldier by the looks of it, was struggling to get to his feet. Zara couldn't understand why he was here, why a human would crash on a planet like this. But the sight of him, alive and seemingly unaffected by the cold, filled her with a strange sense of relief. He might be her chance at survival. Zara hesitated for a moment, still unsure whether to approach him or keep her distance. She had heard of humans, brave, resourceful, and often fighting against alien invaders. But never in her life had she imagined they would come to her aid. What could this man want from her? She was an alien princess, an enemy to most. Yet, here he was. She needed his help, but could she trust him? As the soldier steadied himself, he seemed to notice her, his eyes narrowing in cautious suspicion. Zara could barely stand, her body swaying as the cold took its toll. She staggered forward, collapsing just feet away from him. Her voice was barely a whisper as she forced the words out. "Please, help me." The human soldier paused for a moment, uncertainty flashing across his face. But then, without a word, he moved toward her, reaching out a gloved hand. Zara's heart raced. She had no idea what would happen next, but it was her only chance. She grasped his hand weakly, and he pulled her up. As she leaned against him, she noticed the strength in his grip, the warmth of his body in contrast to the icy landscape around them. "I don't know who you are," he said, his voice rough and weary, "but I'm not leaving you to die here." Zara, too tired to speak, simply nodded. For the first time in hours, she felt the faintest flicker of hope. Zara struggled to stay awake as the human soldier helped her inside the wrecked ship. Her body was numb from the cold, but there was something about his presence that gave her a glimmer of hope. As she stepped into the ship's interior, the warmth from the heat generator hit her like a wave, bringing life back into her frozen limbs. She had never been more thankful for something so simple. The soldier helped her sit on the floor, propping her up against the wall of the small craft. She could feel his eyes on her, studying her. His gaze was sharp, but his expression was unreadable. Zara had never encountered a human before. She had heard of them. Brave, fierce, and known for their ability to survive against all odds. But seeing one in person, so close, was different. He was just a soldier, like the ones who had fought against the Xorian Empire in distant battles. Yet here he was, alone, stranded on this desolate planet. The soldier didn't speak right away. Instead, he turned to a small compartment on the ship and began rummaging through it. Zara's eyes followed him as he worked. He didn't seem to be in a hurry, but he was efficient, moving with purpose. He grabbed a small med kit and approached her cautiously. Zara winced as he knelt down beside her, but she didn't pull away. She could tell he wasn't hostile, at least not yet. "My name's James," the soldier said, breaking the silence. His voice was rough, worn from what she could only guess was days, maybe weeks of survival. "And you?" Zara hesitated for a moment, unsure whether it was safe to reveal her identity. She had been exiled, cast out by her father, the king of the Xorian Empire. If James knew who she was, he might see her as a threat or worse, an enemy. But the fear of dying alone in the cold was stronger than her doubts. "Zara," she replied quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am Zara, daughter of the king of the Xorian Empire." James looked at her for a long moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. He didn't seem shocked or frightened, as she had expected. Instead, his expression softened, though there was still a trace of suspicion. "You're the princess?" he asked, his voice laced with disbelief. Zara nodded, but she didn't feel like a princess anymore. She felt like a broken, betrayed woman, abandoned on a planet that had no mercy. James didn't say anything else at first. Instead, he focused on cleaning the wound on her side, which had been caused by the sharp ice when she fell earlier. Zara winced as he applied the antiseptic, but she didn't flinch away. It was strange. This human, a complete stranger, was treating her injuries like she mattered. For so long, Zara had been nothing but a tool for her father's empire. But here, in this small wrecked ship, she was being treated like a person. As James finished tending to her wound, he sat back and let out a long sigh. Zara's mind was racing, trying to piece together what had happened to lead her here. Her father had cast her out, left her to die on this frozen world. Why? Why had he betrayed her? She had only wanted to stop the cruelty of the Xorian Empire, to bring peace to a people who had been oppressed for generations. But her father had seen her as a threat to his power. She had been a fool to think she could change anything. James seemed to notice the shift in Zora's demeanor. Her shoulders had slumped, and her eyes were clouded with thoughts of her past and the cruelty she had endured. He reached into a compartment on the ship and pulled out a ration pack. "You need to eat," he said gently, offering it to her. She didn't feel hungry, but she knew he was right. She had no strength left. Zora hesitated for a moment before taking the ration. It was bland, but it was food, and she could feel the warmth of it spread through her body as she ate. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it wasn't easy either. She didn't know what to say to this human. She had never been one to trust easily, especially after the betrayal of her own family. But James wasn't like anyone she had met before. There was a quiet strength in him, a calm resolve that made her feel safer than she had in days. So James said after a moment, breaking the silence once again, "What were you doing on this planet? This isn't exactly the kind of place you just stumble upon." Zora lowered her gaze, not sure how to answer. She could tell he was asking out of curiosity, not suspicion. She could lie, but what good would it do? She didn't have the energy to pretend anymore. "I was exiled," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "My father, he's the king of the Xorian Empire. I rebelled against him. I wanted to stop the suffering, to bring peace. But he saw me as a threat, and now he's left me to die here." James didn't say anything for a long moment. He simply looked at her, his eyes filled with understanding. "Sounds like you didn't have much choice in the matter." Zora looked at him, surprised by the empathy in his voice. It wasn't pity, but something else, something real. She had expected him to judge her, to see her as the enemy, but instead he saw her as a person. It was a strange feeling, but one she couldn't quite shake. "If you wanted peace," James continued, "then I can understand why you would fight. But your father doesn't sound like the kind of person who would just let you walk away. It's a dangerous game you're playing." Zora nodded slowly. "I know, but I had to try. I couldn't stand by and watch any longer." James paused, as if considering her words. Finally, he nodded. "I get it. You're not so different from the people I fight for. But you're going to need help if you're going to make it out of here." Zora looked at him, her mind racing. What kind of help could a human soldier provide to someone like her? A princess, exiled and abandoned. But in that moment, she realized something. Maybe, just maybe, the humans were not so different from her. Maybe they could help her after all. And just as she was about to speak, the sound of engines roared from above. The enemy was already searching for her. The battle was about to begin. The sound of engines roaring above shattered the fragile peace inside the wrecked ship. Zara's heart skipped a beat as she turned to James, the human soldier who had been her unexpected savior. He had been quiet since the last conversation, focused on something else, on survival. But now, the air between them felt charged with urgency. Whatever had brought him to this desolate planet, it seemed they had no more time to think about it. The enemy was here. James moved swiftly, checking his gear, adjusting the weapon strapped to his side. His movements were calm, controlled, as if he had faced danger like this 1,000 times before. Zara watched him, still unsure of how to feel about this human who had saved her life, but whose motives were still unclear. What did he want from her? Why had he helped her when she was nothing more than a rebel princess? "Stay low," James said, his voice steady, without a hint of fear. "The ship's compromised. We need to move." Zara nodded, still too weak to stand on her own, but determined to follow his lead. There was no other choice. She had nowhere else to go, and the cold, harsh planet offered no shelter. The only chance she had at survival, perhaps even at redemption, was with this human soldier. Together, they moved through the ship, staying out of sight as much as possible. Zara could hear the faint hum of enemy ships circling above them, the distant whine of weapons powering up. She knew they were coming for her. Her father's soldiers would not stop until they had completed their mission, her death. James led the way to the rear of the ship, where a small escape pod sat in the shadows. It was their only chance of escaping the planet and avoiding the inevitable confrontation. Zara's thoughts raced. If they escaped, where would they go? She had nothing to offer him, nothing to bargain with. She was an outcast, a traitor to her people, and yet here was this soldier who was risking his life for her. As they neared the pod, James stopped and turned to face her. His expression was serious, his eyes focused. "Listen," he said quietly, "this isn't going to be easy. We'll have to work together if we're going to get out of here alive. I know you're from the Xorian Empire, but right now, I'm your best chance." Zara met his gaze. She could feel the weight of his words pressing down on her. Working together. A human soldier and an exiled princess from a ruthless empire. It was almost laughable. Yet, Zara knew that he was right. She had no choice. The enemy would kill her without hesitation, and if she didn't trust him now, she wouldn't survive long enough to regret it. "I'll do whatever it takes," she said, her voice firm despite the fear creeping up inside her. "But you need to understand something. My people, they won't stop until they've finished what they started. And that means they won't just be coming after me. They'll come after you too." James gave a single nod. "I figured as much. But that doesn't change anything. I'm not leaving you here to die." Zora could see the resolve in his eyes, and for the first time since her exile, she felt something she hadn't expected: hope. It was faint, like a flickering flame, but it was there. Together, they might actually have a chance. They continued to the escape pod, where James quickly worked to release the hatch. The pod's hatch opened with a quiet hiss, and the dim, artificial light inside flickered on. It was small, cramped, but it was their only option. James moved inside first, motioning for Zara to follow. She hesitated, a wave of doubt washing over her. She had never been this close to a human before, and now she was about to board a ship with one. It felt wrong on so many levels, yet it was the only chance she had left. Inside the pod, James quickly secured the control panel and prepared for launch. He was calm, efficient, but Zara could see the tension in his shoulders. He was just as aware of the stakes as she was. The enemy ships were closing in, and they didn't have much time. Zara sat across from him, gripping the sides of the seat as the pod's engines began to hum to life. As the pod slowly lifted off the ground, the ship's hull groaned under the pressure of takeoff. Zara glanced out the small viewport, her eyes scanning the swirling snowstorm that covered the planet. It was a blur of white, a world that had been her prison for far too long. Now, as the pod ascended, she couldn't help but feel like she was leaving her old life behind. Her father's empire, her title, the power she had once commanded. It was all gone now, replaced by an uncertain future with a human soldier she barely knew. "You've got a name, Princess." James's voice broke the silence, bringing her back to the moment. Zara looked up at him, surprised by the question. "Zara," she repeated, this time with more confidence. "I told you already." "No, I mean, you've got a nickname or something." He chuckled lightly, though it was a sound full of tension, like he was trying to mask his anxiety with humor. Zara smiled faintly. "Not really. Just Zara." He nodded. "All right, Zara. This might get rough. The Xorian military doesn't like leaving things unfinished. They'll be hunting us." Zara's stomach tightened at the thought. The Xorian Empire was vast, and her father's reach was nearly limitless. The ships chasing them would be relentless, and Zara knew that the Empire would not stop until they had finished what they had started. But in that moment, with the human soldier beside her, she realized something. She might not have the power of her father, but she had something else: determination. "We'll make it," she said, her voice steady now. "We have to." James didn't respond at first, but when he did, his words were filled with a quiet resolve. "Yeah, we will." As the pod broke through the atmosphere, the swirling snowstorm outside faded into the blackness of space. Zara looked out at the stars, feeling a strange sense of freedom. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't running from something. She was running toward something, toward a new life, toward survival, and perhaps toward a future that she hadn't dared to imagine. But the road ahead would not be easy. She and James would have to face the full force of the Xorian Empire together. It would be a battle of survival, one that would test both of them in ways they hadn't expected. But for now, as they soared through the stars, they were partners in a fragile alliance, one that might just be their only chance at surviving the war that was coming. The sound of engines grew louder, and Zara's heart raced. She had no time to waste. The human soldier James had barely finished checking the ship's systems before he turned to her with a grim expression. "We need to move. Now." Zara nodded, her mind quickly shifting from the cold despair of the planet to the immediate danger they were in. The enemy was coming. It wasn't just a simple patrol. This was a full-scale search. They were looking for her, and they wouldn't stop until they found her. Zara's father had made it clear. Her life no longer mattered. She was a traitor to the Xorian Empire, and her death would serve as a warning to anyone who dared to challenge his rule. But James was different. He wasn't a soldier of the Xorian Empire. And yet, here he was, risking his life to help her. Zara had expected nothing like this when she first saw him. Humans were often considered weak by her people, primitive, easily crushed by the might of an empire like hers. But James had proven that wrong over and over again. He had shown her strength, and now he was showing her kindness. "We're not going to survive if we stay here," James said, his voice firm. "The storm is making it hard to see anything, but once it clears, they'll spot us for sure. We have to get moving. Can you stand?" Zora glanced at her still aching body, the cold making every muscle feel stiff and fragile. She had barely recovered from the shock of being abandoned here, but James was right. If she didn't act now, she wouldn't have another chance. Slowly, she pushed herself up, leaning against the side of the ship. Her body trembled, but the warmth of the craft had done wonders. She could feel her strength returning, even if only just a little. "I can walk," she said, though her voice was weak. James didn't hesitate. He moved toward her, his hand offering support as they both stepped into the cold again. The wind howled around them, whipping up the snow and stinging their skin, but James didn't stop. He led her away from the wrecked ship, and they moved toward a small ridge where they could take cover. Behind them, the faint hum of the enemy ships echoed through the storm. Zara knew they wouldn't have much time. Every second was a precious gift, and she wasn't about to waste it. Her mind raced as she tried to think of a way to outmaneuver the enemy. The icy wasteland offered little in terms of hiding places, and the enemy ships would have no trouble scanning the terrain. But there was one thing that might give them an advantage: the storm. It was both a hindrance and an ally. "We need to get to higher ground," Zara said as she glanced up at the ridge. "If we can climb to the top, we might be able to spot any weak spots in their search pattern." James nodded. "I was thinking the same thing." With a shared look of determination, they pressed on, climbing the ridge despite the harsh winds and the freezing cold. The snow crunched beneath their boots, each step a struggle. Zara's breath came in short, painful bursts, but she refused to stop. She couldn't afford to. She had to keep going. She wasn't just running from the Xorians. She was running from everything her father represented. And the further she could get from that empire, the better. By the time they reached the top of the ridge, Zara could see the enemy ships more clearly. They were spread out across the sky, their searchlights scanning the terrain, looking for any sign of life. Zara's heart sank. They were getting closer. If they kept moving in this direction, they'd be caught in no time. "Do you have any ideas?" Zara asked, her voice tight with urgency. James didn't answer immediately. His eyes scanned the horizon, looking for something, anything that could help them escape. Then, after a moment, he turned to her. "I got a plan. But we need to get to a nearby cave system. It's about a kilometer east from here." Zora's eyes widened. "A cave? How do you know about it?" James gave a small, grim smile. "I've been on this planet before, a few years ago. It's not exactly a tourist spot, but it should give us cover." Zora didn't hesitate. "Lead the way." They moved quickly, making their way down the ridge and towards the east, where the cave system James had mentioned was located. The wind bit at their skin, and the snow fell heavier, but the promise of safety pushed them forward. With every step, Zora could feel the enemy closing in. The hum of their ships filled the air, and she knew that if they didn't find cover soon, they would be caught. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the entrance of the cave. It was hidden behind a large formation of jagged rocks, barely noticeable against the stark white landscape. Zora couldn't help but feel a small sense of relief as they ducked inside. The cold outside was brutal, but within the cave, they could finally breathe without the constant threat of detection. James motioned for her to stay low as he peered out into the snowstorm. "We've got a little time, but we need to move fast. They'll be sweeping this area next." Zora nodded, her heart still racing. She was exhausted, physically and mentally, but she knew they couldn't rest for long. The enemy was out there, and they had only moments before the storm cleared enough for their ships to spot them. "How far do we have to go?" Zora asked, her voice strained from the cold and the effort it took to speak. "Not far," James said, his voice low. "Once we make it through the cave system, there's a shuttle hidden on the other side. It's small, but it'll get us off this planet." Zora felt a flicker of hope deep within her. They weren't out of danger yet, but they had a chance, and in a world as cold and unforgiving as this one, a chance was all they could ask for. She knew that they would have to fight for every step they took, but for the first time in days, she wasn't alone. She had James by her side. As they crouched in the cave, waiting for the storm to give them cover, Zora realized something she hadn't fully understood before. The galaxy was vast and full of dangers. Her father's empire was just one of many forces that could crush her. But here, in this freezing wasteland, she had found something she hadn't expected: an ally. And with that ally, perhaps, just perhaps, she could escape the past and find a new future. The cave was silent except for the soft sound of their breathing. Zora could feel the cold seeping into her bones, but she didn't care. They had made it to cover, but the real challenge was ahead. The enemy wasn't going to give up. They would keep searching until they found her, and Zora knew they wouldn't hesitate to kill her if they did. Her father had made it clear. She was to be erased from existence. No one was to know she had ever rebelled. James didn't speak at first. He was crouched near the entrance of the cave, his eyes scanning the horizon through a small crack in the rocks. Zora sat quietly behind him, her mind racing. She had never thought this would be her life. Fleeing across unknown worlds, hunted by her own people. She had once been the princess, the heir to an empire. Now she was a fugitive, hiding in the shadows, with nothing but the clothes on her back and the hope that James could help her escape. The silence stretched on, broken only by the occasional whir of engines in the distance. The storm had started to clear, and it was only a matter of time before the enemy found their hiding spot. Zora's heart pounded in her chest. Every moment felt like it could be their last. "We don't have much time," James said, his voice calm but urgent. He turned to face her. "The ships are getting closer. We can't stay here for long." Zora nodded, her throat tight. She had to think. If they stayed hidden, they might survive for a little while longer, but the enemy would eventually find them. She didn't have much faith in the cave's protection. The ships were sophisticated, with scanners capable of picking up even the faintest heat signatures. They wouldn't be safe for long. "We need to make it to the shuttle," Zara said, her voice low but steady. "The faster we get there, the better our chances." James looked at her, his eyes full of understanding. "I agree, but we can't just walk out there. They'll be watching." Zara's mind raced. She knew James was right. There was no way they could just march across the open wasteland and hope to make it to the shuttle. They needed a plan, something that would give them enough of a head start to escape the enemy's detection. "I have an idea," Zara said, after a moment of silence. "We can use the storm to our advantage. It's still thick enough that they won't be able to see us clearly. We need to move quickly and stay low. If we can reach the next ridge, there's a valley we can hide in. From there, we'll be close enough to the shuttle to make a run for it." James considered her plan for a moment, then nodded. "It's risky, but it's the best we've got. Let's do it." Zara stood up slowly, her legs trembling from the cold and exhaustion, but she forced herself to stay strong. They had no other choice. If they didn't act now, they'd never make it. They moved quickly, keeping low to the ground and using the cover of the storm to hide their movements. The snow was thick, and the wind howled around them, but they didn't stop. Every step felt like it could be their last, but they pushed forward, the urgency of their situation driving them on. The storm was their only advantage. The thick clouds and snow kept the enemy ships from getting a clear line of sight, but Zara knew they couldn't count on it forever. The storm would pass, and when it did, the enemy would have them in their sights. They had to make it to the shuttle before that happened. As they neared the ridge, Zara's heart was pounding in her chest. Her legs were burning, and her breath came in sharp gasps. The cold was unbearable, but she couldn't stop. Not now. The shuttle was so close, and yet so far. Every time she thought they were almost there, the distance seemed to stretch out further. The cold was wearing her down, but she kept going. She couldn't let James down. "Almost there," James whispered as they reached the top of the ridge. Zara nodded, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She could see the valley below them, the faint outline of the shuttle in the distance. It was small, almost invisible against the vast whiteness of the snow, but it was there. It was their only chance. They crouched behind the rocks, waiting for the right moment. Zara's heart pounded as she watched the enemy ships move in the distance. They were close, too close. She could feel her nerves tightening. Any second now, the storm would clear, and they would be exposed. "Ready?" James asked, his voice barely audible over the wind. Zara nodded again. "Ready." Together, they moved down the ridge, staying low and moving as quickly as they could. Every step felt like it could be their last, but they didn't stop. The shuttle was within reach. They could make it. But then, as they were halfway to the valley, the storm began to break. The wind died down, and the sky cleared just enough for the enemy ships to spot them. Zara's heart skipped a beat as she heard the unmistakable roar of engines. They had been seen. "Run," James shouted, his voice urgent. Zara didn't hesitate. She pushed herself harder, sprinting toward the shuttle with all the strength she had left. The enemy ships were coming, and they were closing in fast. The snow beneath her feet was slick, and her body was screaming with exhaustion, but she couldn't stop. Not now. Behind her, she could hear the engines growing louder. The enemy was right behind them. "We're almost there," James yelled. "Keep going." Zara pushed herself harder, her vision blurred by the cold and exhaustion. She didn't know if they could outrun the ships, but she couldn't give up. Not after everything they had been through. With one final push, they reached the shuttle. Zara collapsed against it, gasping for air. James was already inside, working quickly to get the engine started. The enemy ships were close now, just a few hundred meters away, but they were almost safe. Zara climbed into the shuttle, and James slammed the door shut behind her. The engines roared to life, and the shuttle lifted off the ground, shooting into the sky. Zara looked out the window, watching the enemy ships shrink in the distance. They had made it. Against all odds, They had escaped. But as the shuttle soared into the sky, Zara knew that their fight wasn't over. The Xorian Empire was vast, and her father wouldn't stop until he had reclaimed control. But for now, Zara allowed herself a moment of peace. They had won this battle. For now, they were free. The silence inside the shuttle was deafening, a sharp contrast to the chaos they had just escaped. Zara leaned back in her seat, her body trembling from the exhaustion of the harrowing journey. Her mind was racing, processing everything that had happened. The storm, the escape, the near capture. It was all so much, yet here they were, flying away from the icy wasteland that had been her prison for so long. James sat beside her, his eyes focused on the controls, but Zara could see the tension in his face. He had been her protector, her guide, and in the most unexpected way, the love she never thought she would find. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of fear, desperation, and unexpected emotions. Her life had been turned upside down. And now, with James by her side, she was uncertain about what the future held. But there was one thing she knew for certain. They had survived. And together, they would fight for a better world. The shuttle flew through the icy void of space, and Zara glanced at the small monitor showing their path. The journey was long, but they were headed toward a safe haven, an old rebel base hidden on a forgotten planet. It wasn't much, but it was the only place where they could regroup and figure out their next steps. "James," Zara said quietly, her voice breaking the silence. "What happens now?" James didn't look at her immediately, but she could feel his gaze shift as he contemplated her question. He had always been the strong, silent type, but lately there had been moments where he showed vulnerability, and Zara appreciated that. She had come to rely on him more than she ever imagined. "We keep fighting," he said simply, his voice firm but gentle. "The Xorian Empire won't stop looking for you, but we've made it this far, haven't we?" Zara nodded. "But how? How do we win against them?" James gave a small, reassuring smile. "We have something they don't. Each other. The rebels, the humans who've joined this fight, they believe in a cause. They believe in freedom. We'll find allies, gather strength, and we'll fight together. It's not going to be easy, but we can make it happen." Zara swallowed hard. She wanted to believe him. She really did. But the weight of what lay ahead felt almost too much to bear. Her father, the Emperor, was ruthless. He had the power of the Xorian Empire at his disposal, technology far beyond anything humans had. How could they stand against that? James seemed to read her thoughts. He reached over, taking her hand in his, and for a moment she felt the warmth of his touch. It was comforting, like a promise that no matter how difficult things became, they wouldn't face it alone. "You're not alone, Zora," he said softly. "You never will be again." Her heart swelled with emotion. She had always known that James was different from anyone she had met in her life. He was strong, kind, and fiercely loyal. But now, as she looked at him, she saw more than just a soldier. She saw a man who had stood by her side when no one else would, who had believed in her when she had lost all hope. And in his eyes, she saw a future that was worth fighting for. "I trust you," Zara whispered, "and I'll fight with you." James squeezed her hand, his smile widening. "We'll make it through this, Zora. Together." The shuttle continued its journey through space, but the tension in the air had lifted. For the first time in a long time, Zara felt a flicker of hope. She had been betrayed by her own people, abandoned by the father she once idolized. But now, with James by her side, she knew that she had found something even more valuable than the empire she was born into. She had found love, and with it, a new purpose. As the shuttle entered the atmosphere of a distant planet, the ground beneath them shaking with the force of entry, Zara's thoughts turned back to her people, the people of the Xorian Empire. She had once believed in their superiority, their power, but now she saw the cracks in the foundation. The empire was built on fear, oppression, and greed. They had ruled with an iron fist, But Zara knew that power was only temporary. The rebellion had already started, and with James and the rebels' help, it could spread across the galaxy. They landed at the rebel base, a hidden facility built into the side of a mountain. The area was remote, surrounded by dense forests that made it nearly impossible for the Empire to detect. Zara was both relieved and apprehensive. They had made it this far, but the hard work was only just beginning. As they disembarked from the shuttle, the cold air of the planet hit them. Zara wrapped her arms around herself, still shaken from the cold of the previous planet. But there was a fire burning inside her now. She was no longer a princess of a broken empire. She was a revolutionary, a leader, and her journey had only just begun. "Welcome to the rebel base," a voice called out from the shadows. Zara turned, her heart pounding as she saw a group of rebels approaching. Among them was a woman, tall and strong, with piercing green eyes and an air of confidence. She had the look of someone who had seen battles, who had lived through loss, and who was ready to fight for what was right. "We've been waiting for you," the woman said with a nod. "It's time to take back what's ours." Zara felt a surge of pride and determination. She had come so far, and she was ready to give everything for the future she believed in. The journey ahead would be dangerous, and there would be many more battles to fight. But with James by her side, and with the strength of the rebels, Zara knew they had a chance. Together, they would take down the Empire. Together, they would fight for freedom. Together, they would change the galaxy forever. As they walked toward the base, Zara held her head high. Her past no longer defined her. It was the love and the revolution she fought for now. And that was worth everything.